To say the world of media and communications has changed over the last 30 years is an understatement. The introduction of the internet not only changed how we report news, but it has also impacted how, when, and why people consume this information. Our first session today is going to explore how we got to this critical moment and what the implications are on perceptions of mental health and substance use disorders. The discussion will be led by a moderator who has spent his career fighting to eliminate stigma and discrimination in mental health and substance use disorder. Mark Ishaug is CEO of Thresholds, an organization that provides services and resources for persons with serious mental health illnesses and substance use disorders in Illinois. Mark is also a founding board member of the Kennedy Forum, Illinois. We are grateful to have him here today. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Jim. I'm so happy to be part of today's program, and I'm especially happy to talk about this topic, which is so important to me, both personally and professionally. I was fortunate enough to participate in a meeting in Hyannisport that Patrick had mentioned earlier, which brought together leaders in mental health, substance use, and journalism. We spent the day, beautiful day, having a very tough conversation on media, journalism, and even on our own language and how words can so profoundly influence people's understanding and perceptions of reality. Stereotypes depicting people living with mental health or substance abuse disorders as being dangerous, unpredictable, responsible for their illness, or generally incompetent can lead to active discrimination, such as excluding people from employment, social, and educational opportunities. And these displays of discrimination can become internalized, leading individuals with a mental health or substance use condition to believe the negative, and in turn, think of themselves as unable to recover, undeserving of care, dangerous, or responsible for their illness. The media has the power to help the public better understand these conditions by providing accurate depictions of individuals that avoid sensationalizing the news items and counter the perceptions, the prejudice, and the negative beliefs that are often associated with these conditions. I am so excited today to discuss how fair and accurate coverage in the media can help create a society where people feel supported and where people are willing to seek and receive treatment. Our first panelist is a great friend to the Kennedy Forum, Kate Snow. Kate is the anchor of NBC Nightly News Sunday and an award-winning senior national correspondent for NBC News. Her reporting appears across platforms of NBC News and MSNBC. She currently contributes regularly to Nightly News with Lester Holt, Today, and Dateline NBC. Our next panelist is Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, a project of Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, encouraging innovative reporting on violence, conflict, and tragedy worldwide. An award-winning reporter on human rights, criminal justice, and politics, Shapiro is contributing editor of The Nation and U.S. correspondent for Late Night Live on Australian Broadcasting Corporation's national radio. Bruce is the recipient of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Public Advocacy Award for outstanding and fundamental contributions to the social understanding of trauma. And our third panelist is Carrie Cobham. Carrie is a leader in the digital news space with over a decade of experience in journalism, digital storytelling, and newsroom leadership. She has mentored some of the most accomplished women in journalism after attending the inaugural Online News Association Poynter Leadership Academy for Women in Digital Media, and later serving as Academy faculty. Carrie currently serves as the Senior Associate Director of the Rosalind Carter Fellowships for Mental Health Journalism and Media at the Carter Center. In this role, she oversees operations, training, sustainability, and expansion of the journalism fellowships in the US, Latin America, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. And Kate, I'm going to start out with you, if you don't mind. In your work, you have gone out of your way, and I have witnessed this, to accurately and compassionately report on mental health, ranging from your own family's tragic loss of your father-in-law to the increased need for telehealth, to the pandemic's impact on teens and teen mental health. So if you could, if you don't mind, tell us what motivates you to discuss mental health the way that you do, and what role do you believe journalism has in telling this important story?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. It's funny because people ask me how I ended up doing a lot of reporting around mental health. It was kind of accidental. Wasn't necessarily an intentional choice of mine in the beginning. I have always gravitated towards stories that touch on the human condition in some way. I do a lot of medical stories. I do a lot of, now tons on mental health and substance use. I also do a lot of stories that center on kind of dark parts of the human condition, sexual assault, the Me Too movement, all that. I guess part of it was what you just mentioned, that my father-in-law died by suicide, and that was in 2010. So that's 11 years ago now. And that I had already been doing some reporting on mental health, but I think that really kickstarted a new chapter for me because in my own personal life, we were dealing with this devastating loss, and we were trying to process and reading things. And, I was talking to therapists, frankly, and experts. And so it sort of, I guess, led me to pitch more stories in that vein. And then the more I pitch stories, I guess the theme of all my stories is things that are undercovered, things that aren't, at least back then, weren't being seen as much on network television. Those are kind of the stories that I looked for, is things that needed to have a light shined on them. And the more I did those stories, the more my bosses, the producers and the senior producers of the broadcasts started realizing that they should tap me for those stories. Like when they wanted to do a mental health story, they would ask Kate to do it. And so over a decade now, I've kind of become known as one of the people. There are other colleagues of mine who also report on mental health, but I'm probably, if you did a story count, I'm probably the person that does the most reporting on mental health at NBC. And to your second question, I mean, look, it's essential. It's like covering like leukemia or diabetes. Of course, we're going to cover those stories. We also need to cover mental health. I say to people all the time, because someone wise said this to me a long time ago, we all have mental health. We all have a brain. It's an organ in our body. And, we all have to take care of it, just like we watch our heart and our liver and everything else. So I think that the culture, and we can talk about this, but I think the culture in the US has come around more to that too. I think people are treating mental health in the broader society differently than we used to talk about it. So that has helped. As a journalist, I think that's helped my ability to tell these stories and to get attention on these stories and get editors and producers to want to tell these stories, is because everybody is talking about it more than they used to.
Well, I'm curious. It feels like everything today has a mental health implication. How can you not talk about the drastic flooding that we experienced just in the last couple of days, climate change, violence in our cities, voter rights being taken away as we speak? It seems like everything that we are dealing with today cannot be, I think, discussed or reported on without talking about the mental health components of what we are experiencing. Does that ring true for you, or?
Absolutely. I mean, when COVID hit, the first phone call I got from our executive producer of Nightly News was, what story can you tell about the mental health implications of what's happening to us? The shutdown. I mean, remember those early weeks when the kids lost their school and we all stayed home? And I mean, I did numerous stories in the first month of the pandemic about the impact that it was having in various different ways on different, really, a lot of them were like group focused, right? I did a story about seniors. I did a story about working parents. I did stories about kids. and we continue to. So you're absolutely right that, you know, there are all kinds of, like, there are too many stories to be told that touch on mental health. I don't have a problem finding stories. If anything, it's hard to just like have enough real estate to tell all the stories that we'd like to tell.
So Bruce, I'm going to turn to you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Your work at the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma promotes ethical and thorough reporting of trauma and compassionate professional treatment of victims and survivors by journalists. So what does this mean? What does ethical reporting look like? And how are we doing more of it, or should be doing more of it?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question, Mark. As you and Kate were discussing, mental health issues are so central to the news agenda, right? I mean, people who have pre-existing vulnerabilities, mental health issues, people who have mental health issues thrust upon them by violence and trauma. Even as a society, the most important decisions that we make, do we go to war or not? How do we deal with violence against women? How do we deal with historical legacies of racism? All of these have some kind of mental health dimension to them. And, historically, in our training as journalists, in our toolkits, we haven't necessarily had a lot of language for that, right? I mean, we know how to do interviews with people who have a whole lot of power, and our job is to keep them on the record and make sure that they keep talking and give us good sound bites and clips. We're good at that. Some of us have, including Kate and Carrie too, are people who have thought a lot about how to report on vulnerable people. But I think there's, effective reporting, and there's a lot of it, a growing tradition of effective reporting on mental health inflected issues means reporting that is informed by evidence-based science in the background. You wouldn't send someone to cover a football game who doesn't know what an end run is or what a goal is, yet we send reporters out to cover, family members who've lost someone to murder or suicide. We do other kinds of issues without really knowing what issues like trauma or depression or psychological injury mean, right? So a little bit of evidence-based science that should be in every reporter's toolkit. Some effective interviewing that gives people time and respect and a little bit of agency over the conversation, is not just about the sort of extractive approaches that are like, oh, I got a great quote today, right? Which many of us in our reporting career have committed, right? Reporting which contextualizes whatever mental health issues are, not only in terms of vulnerability, but in terms of resilience and the ability of individuals and communities and our entire country to sort of meet the challenge. I think that's very important. I sometimes tell my journalism students, if you want to know what ethical reporting on vulnerable people or on mental health looks like, imagine that your mother were being the subject of a news report. How would you want them to be treated? I think that's one very good standard. At the same time, I would ask folks who think about this, everybody here at this important conference, to acknowledge that for reporters, rather than the media capital T capital M, for reporters, covering mental health either as issues or encountering people with vulnerabilities in the course of our reporting is a huge craft challenge. It's easy to slam the media for perpetuating stigma, and I do a fair amount of that myself. But I would also ask people to recognize really powerful, effective reporting when you see it, whether it's a local news site, NPR station, whatever, or national media, and find a way to reach out and acknowledge the reporter's good work, whether it's by sharing a story that you think really captures it well, or by directly contacting journalists. We as news professionals come in for a lot of hits and deserve them sometimes, but there's right now a tidal wave of abuse against journalists who are doing the hard labor of bearing witness for really vulnerable people who have experienced trauma gender violence, sexual harassment, racism, and everywhere from the local level to the national level, reporters are coming in for a lot of abuse. So just as if you see something, say something when there's a problem in life, if you see something that's good in reporting, find a way to acknowledge it. I think that's a really important thing right now that will strengthen reporters' own ability to go to their editors and producers and say, see, people want this kind of reporting. We need to know that this reporting is recognized and acknowledged.
Yeah, that's such a great point. Especially on Twitter, people are so fast to criticize and point out everything that we do wrong. Journalists, CEOs of mental health organizations, what have you. It's much rarer where you get the feedback of what you're doing right and sharing stories about how we can do better and do more right and more good together.
Yeah.
Carrie, I'm
if I may, Mark, there's just one other thing I just wanted to add here, which is that it's also important to remember that there are major issues, society transforming issues connected with mental health that are on the public agenda today only because of the hard labor of journalists. Something like the Me Too movement grew out of reporting on sexual harassment that took years of reporters developing techniques and strategies to learn how to do. This is a new kind of reporting. Reporting on abuse within religious institutions and schools. That too, featured in the movie Spotlight. If you watch Spotlight, you're watching reporters trying to create a way of telling a story no one had told before. So again, while we do call out media for getting it wrong and advancing stigma, I think we also need to acknowledge the hard work that's been done by a generation of journalists, including some of the folks here today, to get these issues on the public agenda.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Carrie, I'm going to turn to you now. In your work at the Rosalind Carter Fellowships for Mental Health Journalism, you train plethora of journalists to accurately report on mental health and substance abuse and provide them with the tools needed to produce this high quality work that reflects a deeper understanding of these disorders and challenges and diseases. Can you talk to us specifically about the tools and skills that journalists need and that you're helping provide?
Sure. So Kate was talking earlier about how extensively she's covered mental health over the last decade or more. And then the fellowships were founded in 1996. And I think all of us here know that in the 90s, the conversations around mental health, the reporting around mental health was pretty much non-existent, right? And then what did exist was not informed, it continued to contribute to stigma around mental health because this public discourse and these conversations were not happening. And so part of the goal of the fellowships is to work with folks within mental health to develop best practices around reporting on mental health. And Bruce touched on some of them already, trauma-informed reporting, following the science, but we're also taking a person first and people-centered approach and looking, interviewing people, approaching people, talking to people, producing stories about people because we are people, right? We are more than the mental health conditions that we live with. We are whole people. And so part of what we do with the fellowships is that we provide journalists and in particular our fellows with resources around what are the best practices for mental health reporting. What is the language that we should be using that does not, continue to stereotype people who live with mental health disorders or contribute to stigma? What are our good sources for data? Over the last 2 decades, we've trained over 225 journalists through our program as fellows, and then trained independently hundreds more. And what we've realized is that it's so important as the folks in the media who have the audience to be telling those stories appropriately, to be telling the stories in ways that don't contribute to the stigma. Now, what we've also seen, I think, over the past few years, and, few is probably minimizing it, but, for an extended period of time, and Bruce knows this very well, is that as we report on mental health and we want to be mindful of these best practices, we as journalists also have to be mindful of our own mental health. And I think just in particular over the past few years, outside of journalists who have, directly reported out of conflict zones, we're finally starting to realize that, interviewing people who are in grief or who have been through trauma does have an impact on you. Reporting on difficult topics as a reporter does have an impact on you. And so we also have to consider where we are as journalists in order to properly tell our job. Properly tell our stories and do our job. And we can't do our job if we're not taking care of our mental health. As Kate mentioned, brain is an important organ in our body, and we need to take care of it in the same way that we take care of our physical health. And so now, those resources that we provide and that we prioritize do include the best practices, and they do include what kind of language that you should be using to report on mental health if you are, through our language guide on behavioral health that we produced a few years ago. But we also have to think about what are the mental health resources that journalists are being provided with or that we have access to, because part of the story of telling the stories of mental health is also taking care of our own.
So do you have a good story or two that you want to share about the work that you've done with any, you don't have to name names, but just sort of curious if anything stands out to you that you're really excited about in this important work that you've done, and where you've seen noticeable change?
Yeah. I think one of the most exciting things that we have seen is that we did a study a couple of years ago doing a deep dive into the stories that fellows have produced on mental health and behavior and substance use issues. And we found that 1 in 7 fellows, the work of 1 in 7 fellows, resulted in a direct change in public policy, whether that is on a local level, on an organizational level, a state or a federal level. Mrs. Carter has been heavily involved, since President Carter was in the governor's office here in Georgia, and before that in mental health advocacy. So she's played a huge role in moving forward federal legislation around parity and the equal coverage of mental health in the same way that it would be covered by insurance. Physical health would be covered by insurance. So it has been incredibly heartening to see that the work that the fellows are doing are also contributing to community change and to change within the country and within their states. We have had folks that have, one fellow I know reported on issues within a particular institution, a mental health institution in their state. That institution, it led to the institution being closed and state funding being allocated for alternative solutions. So that's just one example in dozens, but we are seeing real change, and we can trace it directly back to work that journalists are doing and the impact that they're having directly in their communities.
Great. Kate, I want to circle back to something that you said about, I think it was like, there's limited space.
I guess it's real estate.
Real estate. That's what it was. Real estate, limited real estate. Yeah. And you talked a lot, and everybody's talked about how individual journalists can strengthen their own understanding and reporting. But tell us a little bit about the business. I don't know if it's the back office you would call it, or the, what do you call it? Those folks, the people that are running the stories, maybe, or the editors.
Talking about the bosses?
The bosses, yeah. Sorry, I'll just clear the bosses.
In the TV, in the broadcast world, it is, I work with producers, right, to put stories together, sometimes bookers who will, find someone and book them for us. And then I work with senior producers at each broadcast, and then the executive producer is the top person at the broadcast. And then there are lots of layers above them, the president of NBC News, for example. Look, I would say two things. One, where I work, I really do love where I work, and for a lot of reasons, but NBC, we have a commitment to this field. Like and I'm not just blowing smoke. Like we really, if you look at our body of work as a whole, not just mine, you can see that the bosses are committed to reporting on mental health. So that's one thing. I mean, that I feel supported, right? I feel like I can pitch these stories and they'll get an audience. We just last week did another Kids Under Pressure series, got some attention in the media. I had a piece that I did last week. So the point is we have whole franchises now. We call them franchises, like labeled, intentional periods of time where we focus on mental health. That said, nightly news is, when you take out the commercials, it's like 22, 23 minutes, right? And the Today Show is longer, so there's a little more space to do longer stories. And Dateline, of course, is longer. But, there's a limit to how much we can do. And so sometimes I'm not going to name names, but sometimes I will do a story like the one I shot 2 months ago, and it'll sit for a while because it's not, and it's a story that has to do with teen suicide, and everyone wants it to air. It's not a question of like, it's going to get on TV, but sometimes other things happen, flooding happens and natural disasters happen and COVID happens. And so, the broadcast is limited by space, and they can't fit in a 3-minute piece that has to do with teen suicide. So it's going to air very soon. But just to say that, that's the limit that I was talking about, is that there's only so much. And I think it's the same in newspapers and radio, that there's only so much space. So what I encourage in my shop is for people to really think about, what are we devoting all that space to, right? And we have conversations every day in our editorial meetings about how we're going to divvy up that 23 minutes. I might have my number wrong, but whatever it is, the nightly news time, and it's a conversation every day about how much we do on which subject. And I do think the good news is that mental health is in that conversation all the time now, where when I started in journalism, I've worked for 3 networks now. When I started at a couple other networks, I don't remember, and Bruce could probably speak to this, I just don't remember there being so much content that had to do with, in some way, people's mental health.
There would be individual correspondents or individual reporters who would push crucial stories about mental health or institutionalization or other things forward, but it was not systematically on the news agenda. Look, I think there's been a generational change in public consciousness. I think certainly issues like trauma and PTSD, suicide, depression do have much more currency in popular culture. And that is helping news stories get surfaced and helping reporters like Kate push things forward. Though I would also say we need to be thinking about a couple of other interesting challenges. One of them is, it's not only that there's just 22 minutes of news time in a national newscast, it's that all over the country, from the largest networks down to little tiny local news organizations, our industry is under intense economic pressure. There are fewer reporters than there ever are in a 24-hour news cycle that's very competitive, and where it can be hard for even dedicated reporters to get their organizations to commit the resources to in-depth reporting. And this is another reason why positive feedback is, along with criticism, is so important. News organizations need to know that there's a public stake. The good news, I think, is that there's also a big generational shift. Kate and Carrie, I don't know if you see this, but I certainly see in many newsrooms now that younger reporters, those in their 20s, into their early 30s, have a new and big commitment to mental health. It's very much part of their vocabulary in a different way. They are pushing these stories forward. And also, to something Carrie was saying earlier, pushing forward news organizations' duty of care to journalists who are covering difficult material over and over and over again and have vulnerabilities around secondary trauma, moral injury, and other issues. So I do think there's a lot of good news in a challenging landscape, right? But the choices that journalists make are in a very competitive, economically stressed, and limited zone that makes it particularly important that we find ways of advocates, scientists, journalists having a collaborative conversation to keep the agenda moving.
Mark, can I say one other thing?
Please.
Just 'cause you called it the business, and I just don't want anyone to have the wrong impression. At least where I work, it's not like the stories that I cover are driven by some business imperative. I mean, it doesn't matter if we're going to get ratings or not on a story that I do that touches on mental health. I want to say that out loud because I think people who aren't in our industry may have this impression that like the bean counters that own NBC Universal Comcast are telling me what to do. It doesn't work. I mean, Bruce knows it doesn't work like that. I'm separate. The editorial process is separate from the business side.
And I think there's two dimensions of that. There's a formal dimension and understanding the independence of newsrooms from corporate imperatives is something that deserves respect, right, when you see it. Secondly, most reporters I know on all kinds of beats think of themselves as in a public service profession. Very few people go into journalism to get rich, and if they do, they're quickly disabused of that idea, right? This is a public service profession. And so when communities of mental health advocates, for example, are looking to engage with reporters, producers, editors, whether locally or nationally, do remember that motivation is at the bottom of our commitments. It doesn't mean we are always going to get it right or that we don't need a whole lot of reorientation sometimes. But that's a very important way of thinking about the news profession's engagement with mental health issues.
That's a really good point. I appreciate you clarifying that, Kate. Though I am curious if the public service work that you described that you do impacts other fields outside of journalism. So if everyone is in the journalism world is using the right language and using the right tools and being respectful. And then I think about entertainment and the big media, non-journalism companies, perhaps, where shows used and characters are called addicts, or people are called crazy, or the depiction for the general population in the media outside of journalism reinforces those stereotypes. And people just say, oh, well, that's crazy is just an American word that we use, or addict, that's the shortest way to describe somebody that is suffering. So do you think that this good work that you're describing, is there evidence that it is having impact in media beyond journalism and beyond public service journalism?
You know, Mark, I think we are all journalists here. So we can control what we can control, right? Which is to say what's in our own reporting. And that's why the Dart Center that I direct recently published a trauma-informed reporting style guide that includes specific guidance around language like not using addict or how to talk about suicide in news stories. But there is a trickling out from the news, the sort of presumption of American press freedom, right, is that journalism is the capillary system for public understanding. And that does trickle out into how people talk about themselves, how writers in Hollywood talk about and take up issues. Writers in Hollywood, producers have become champions in some cases of various kinds of mental health issues and depicting them accurately and well in film. And that has an impact. Change doesn't happen overnight. It's an accretive process. And I think in news, we're at a kind of crucial, we play one role in that. We also play an important role in, and you mentioned this in your own intro, in how folks touched by mental health issues see themselves, see their families, what language as a society we use is something that I think matters a lot. And there have been studies showing that, for example, the ways in which people engage with coverage of terrorism events or other kinds of violent events has a direct mental health impact. The kinds of language that's used matters. It's consequential.
Anybody else?
I want to let Carrie comment
I
on
know.
that.
Well, yeah, Carrie?
I think that we've been a lot more focused on the best practices around reporting in the media because we are a public service, because we do feel a sense of responsibility to the people in our community and the stories that we share. But I am seeing that there is change, there is movement within the entertainment industry as well. So I really wish I could remember the name of the report, but I think over the last, Bruce is laughing, but over the past couple of months, there has been a convening of folks within the entertainment industry and in mental health to develop best practices for TV and for movies, etc. So that is out there, and I see that as a positive. I mean, we have the power of the pen, and I have a TV background as well, Kate. So I'm just, but we have the power of the pen. We have the audience, and the credibility as the truth tellers. And so people look to us for the information, and they look to us for the way to communicate that information, right? So if we're communicating it appropriately, then those are the cues that people are taking. But they're also consuming entertainment media, and we hope that that what's being produced now is very different from what we've seen like in the 70s and the 80s. And I think you can all agree, like if you go back and you watch TV shows from the 80s and the 90s, the question is like, oh, does this hold up? A lot of it does not. But what we're seeing now is different from what we saw back then. So there has been some movement, maybe not as quick as we would like, but there has been some movement. And I think the last year has really doubled down on the importance of not layering onto the stigma that already exists.
And Mark, there have been some significant popular culture figures who have foregrounded their own mental health struggles. I mean, Congressman Kennedy is one of them. But for instance, the biggest influencer of them all, Oprah, has just co-written a book with a neuroscientist called "What Happened to You," which she wrote with a wonderful psychiatrist and neuroscience named Dr. Bruce Perry, which is just conversations between them about the impact of early childhood experiences, early childhood trauma, how that carries forward in people's mental health and other life course issues. She's become a champion for that. You saw Simone Biles being so wonderfully frank about her own challenges during the Olympics, even though she had rocks thrown at her as a consequence. It was a very courageous thing to do. People like Angelina Jolie and others have, put these issues out there in a way that never, ever would have been possible a generation ago. So there has been some progress.
So I want to talk about self-care for a few minutes, if you don't mind. The work that you all do, reporting on trauma, on violence, on death by suicide, on death by overdose. This is really hard, traumatic stuff. Would you share with us how you take care of yourselves and how you encourage others in your profession to take care of themselves so that they can go back every single day and do this hard work?
I'll take that first. I also want to say, relative to the last discussion we were having too, that it's a work in progress, right? Like I certainly don't feel like I have mastered the language and all the pitfalls. I mean, I'm still guilty of saying things sometimes, or writing something and having someone else catch it and say, hey, that sounds insensitive. So nobody's perfect. And I think I'll get to the self-care, but I think my generation, right? I've been in this business for 30 years. So we learned on the job. Like I learned how to talk to people, how best to interview someone who's been through something traumatic. I learned that on the job. So I love what Carrie and Bruce are talking about in terms of toolkits and helping newsrooms educate themselves. NBC's done a little bit of that. We have style guidelines and things on the language that we use, but I think journalism schools and colleges, everybody needs to get an education maybe before they start the job, if possible, because I had to do it, on the fly. And that applies to self-care too. Like at some point, I realized that I was starting to really, my work brings me down sometimes, but also I have 2 kids. I have 2 teenagers, not to throw them under the bus, but it's a little hard. And so, look, I've been really open that I have a therapist who I see and talk to. I'm not embarrassed about that. I'm not ashamed of that. It helps me. And my company, anytime anything happens, they just sent an email 2 days ago because of the flooding situation. They're always sending emails with, here are the resources, here are the links to places where you can get help in terms of, if you need mental health therapy or whatever. So that part of it. And then I try, there's a couple things I do. One, every time I start an interview, all my producers know, I always tell people before we start, I didn't do it to you guys today, but I usually say, look, let's just stop for a second and take a nice in through the nose, out through the mouth a few times. I do that with every person I sit down with, no matter what subject we're talking about, because it helps me too. It makes my shoulders relax, and also not perfect on so many people meditate and do all that. I'm not great at that, but I do exercise a lot. I try to run, I try to do yoga because those things help me. And I try to get sleep, although it's a challenge in our industry. I try. Those are the things that I guess I focus on. I spend time with my kids. That helps me separate. And I guess when I feel like it's kind of like when you're a doctor, I assume when you're a doctor, you can't, when you're doing the operation and you're in the operating room, you're just doing the operation, right? So when I'm doing an intense interview or on the scene of a horrific shooting or whatever it is, I do my job. And then when I come home, I think is more when I process and try to help myself get through.
So I did a story for a pointer on self-care for journalists a while back, and there's so many components to it. So the first thing I want to touch on is, I think for all of us, when we hear self-care, whether you're in journalism or not, people tend to think about self-care as like this big coordinated thing where you go to the spa or you take multiple days off, and it doesn't have to be that way. It's great. By all means, I will take a day at the spa for self-care. But very often self-care can just be centering yourself in the moment or doing 5 minutes more each day of one thing that lifts you up, whether it's music or going for a walk or taking a deep breath or doing chair yoga, like whatever works for you. I think it's important for folks to know that self-care can just be 1 or 2 small things that work for you. It's accessible, right? The other thing I think that's really important, especially if you are managing journalists, is to normalize the conversation around mental health. And Kate mentioned how her organization regularly communicates and sends mental health resources for staff, especially around big traumatic news events. Very important. But also if you're leading a team, it's so important to be open and honest about conversations around mental health. So, for example, Kate said, there's no shame in saying, I have a therapist. I go to that therapist often. Or I talk to them about what's stressing me out at work. I think as managers, it's also a responsibility to have those mental health conversations. So I have, like you, Kate, I have said, like, this shooting has been particularly traumatic. Here are the resources that we have in-house. I'm going to take a few days after this news cycle because I need to take some time, because this has impacted me in a difficult way. And I think that opens up the conversation for other folks in the newsroom to feel like, okay, not only is my organization committed to mental health, but the person who is in charge, or who is in charge of the team, is open to this sort of thing. And so it makes people feel a little bit more comfortable that there's space to do that. I think another important thing is to look out for the folks around you and pay attention to, has this person been covering for an extended period multiple traumatic stories that could have a significant impact, and can they be reassigned to cover something a little bit different so that there is space. So, in terms of self-care for me, I also have 2 young children. They're not quite teenagers yet. They're amazing, but also they're young children. So, I have removed Outlook notifications from my phone, because otherwise my phone would just be going bling, 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 bling all of the time. I have assigned offline time to myself, which means when I'm having dinner with my kids, I am not checking email. I am not on social media. We live and breathe the news when we're in media, and we really need to step back from that and not make it so much a part of our identities and our time off. I do the 5-minute thing where I'm like, okay, I really like taking hot showers. So I will take a 10-minute hot shower instead of a 5-minute hot shower. And that is self-care for me. But all of these things, I think when you make that effort, you start adding them up, they become more than Band-Aids to burnout, because they become part of your routine, part of your way of looking out for yourself, and having that self-awareness of, I'm really stressed out right now. What can I do? Or I just went through a traumatic interview. How do I process that? And what do I usually implement that works for me? And so different things work for different people. But I think when you find the right combination that works for you, and then you implement them consistently, or as much as you possibly can, then you're able to stay a little bit more sane than if you were just kind of floundering.
Mark, if I could contextualize this a little bit, this is remarkable. And I think Carrie and Kate will agree that not many years ago, the idea that at a national conference in front of public, journalists would be talking about their own self-care and vulnerabilities and all this would have been laughed out of the room, right? This is a real revolution in American journalism and journalism around the world, right? And there actually is research, interestingly, to back it up. There have been a lot of studies of journalism done just in the last 20 years after it never being looked at all. And they all show the same thing. They show that throughout our profession, whether it's at the local level or the national level, international level, journalism is a trauma-facing profession. Whether we're covering floods or crime or conflict in a direct way, or having that steady drip, drip, drip of difficult interviews with people whose stories we are carrying around, or people on the desk, young people on the desk who are dealing day in, day out with the flood of social media, who are verifying police shooting videos, verifying images from war or from floods, editing, picture editors. On the whole, journalists absorb far more distress and trauma than the general public. The interesting thing is that despite that heavy load, actually we're a resilient profession. It turns out that doing what Carrie and Kate have described helps, but also doing our job well, having a public service commitment, having the craft skills to tell important stories in a timely way to deadline in ways that are compelling, having good colleagues, all of these are measurable buffers for journalists, as they are for other responders against the impact of events. And along with the kind of very specific individual self-care strategies that Kate and Carrie articulated so perfectly, and I feel like now a big part of what we do at the Dart Center can just go out of business because now we're just having this conversation, right? I would highlight one other thing. All the studies that have been done of journalists show that the single most important resilience factor for journalists who are coping well with distressing material is the strength of our collegial and social support. So some news organizations, including NBC, are looking at peer support strategies, right? A few big news organizations have actually created formal journalist peer support networks where journalists throughout in every newsroom and bureau get a little bit of education in how to be a good colleague to others. Sometimes it's just informal, but I see this. I see these self-care strategies not as something, and I say this even to my students at the beginning of their careers, and it's not just something you do when you're really tired, or it's not just something you do when you know the story's hard, or it's not just something you do because we deserve it when we have a good moment or the time. It's as central to our capacity as journalists. Self-care is essential to our ability to achieve, as knowing how to get quotes or get images or capture sound, as knowing how to do an interview. It's got to be a basic part of every journalist's toolkit, because the flip side, the cost to the journalist is that, our basic mechanisms of our work depend a lot on our ability to engage helpfully with the world. And when that's undermined by psychological injury, it can really undermine people's ability to do compassionate reporting, effective reporting, or do the job, right? So this is an important conversation throughout the industry now. And here again, I want to take off my hat to younger journalists in their 20s who are really pushing American newsrooms in particular to have a more aggressive duty of care to news professionals who are affected by what we cover, by abuse we receive online and in the real world, who are affected by a steady diet of toxic material. It's an important part of doing the job.
And I just want to quickly add, Mark, before we go on to the next thing, that I think it's also particularly important to acknowledge the fact that we work with colleagues in our newsrooms who are being directly impacted by the state of the world, right? And so there are journalists of color in our newsrooms who are affected every single time that there is, a shooting of an unarmed Black man yet again. There are colleagues in our newsrooms who are immigrants, who are affected directly by policies, who are affected by deportation. There are colleagues who are part of the LGBTQ community who are affected by violence and who are affected by policies. And so, there are specific stories that impact journalists in different ways. And that's something that we also need to be mindful of as we're planning our coverage and we're offering this support and we're offering up suggestions for self-care strategies. We just need to be mindful that there are, specific communities working in journalism who are being even more heavily impacted than others. And that's something that I definitely want us to acknowledge.
Yeah, thank you so much for addressing that. As just a consumer of journalism and the people, I run a mental health nonprofit here in Chicago with 1,200 employees, majority people of color, and a diverse group of people doing good, hard work every single day, and are consumers of good journalism and hopefully your good journalism, but are deeply affected by the barrage of news. And I heard from so many of my staff that they sometimes just stop. They don't listen to the news. They don't read the news. They don't turn on the TV for days because they cannot consume another bit of bad news. I wish we had time to have a conversation about how to build resiliency in consumers of your good product, because I think a lot of people are, either doom scrolling or turning off, and there has to be some way to balance the consumption of this news that we need so that we can be activists, in fact, without being turned off by the trauma of the news.
Oh, I think it's so important that news consumers create boundaries and be mindful of what you're consuming and when, and not getting trapped in the kind of constant cycle of arousal that comes not just with the news, but with every tweet and every news alert and every calendar alert, as a couple of you were saying earlier, right? It's really important. I think, Mark, the point you make that's so crucial, especially for folks working activists on mental health issues, is to remember that we need to be not just hyper aware and therefore kind of hyper vigilant and in a state of arousal, but engaged effectively. And that means sometimes not listening to the news. That means deliberately bringing positive images into your head or looking at other kinds of stories to remind yourself of what else there is in the world. It can mean shutting off alerts on your phone. And it also means that wonderful thing that Kate described at the beginning of an interview is also wonderful to do at the beginning and end of listening to the news every night. I find myself sometimes at 7 o'clock as nightly news ends, doing a little 3 breaths, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It's very helpful to attend in a meaningful way to the news rather than being just owned by it in ways that keep our own arousal high and keep us anxious and may trigger all the distress that so many of us carry around in one way or another. Self-care for news and consumers is really important, especially when there are sort of high emotion events that we identify with for one reason or another, that affect us because of identity, which is never neutral, that affect us because of where we live, or that simply are so overwhelming. It's really important to practice self-care.
I do not want this conversation to end. I am so grateful. I have not checked my email once in the hour that I have been with you. I turned off my phone. I have not gone through a news feed. This was very selfishly like one of the best hours of the year for me. So I am so grateful for you. And in wrapping this up, I'm just going to ask you all to say very briefly anything that you want to say, anything that's important to you, that's important to this discussion, anything that you would like me to know and to do, or our vast audience of friends involved with the Kennedy Forum, and everyone out in the ether here who's listening and absorbing this that I know wants to do good and do it well. So I'm just going to ask you to do a round robin to close us out with your words of wisdom or anything that you want to share. And I'm going to start with Kate.
Wow, no pressure. Words of wisdom. Listen, by the way, there's a segment that we do on Sunday nights at the end of Nightly News called There's Good News Tonight. And we have had more response. I get more response to that segment every week than any other by far. When we were talking about news consumption and trying to, I think you got to balance out. I do this in my own life. You can't always be watching the worst possible stories about humanity. I would say to assuming that the audience watching this contains a lot of people who work in the mental health field, the way that I find stories often, and the Kennedy Forum knows this because they send me ideas all the time, it's through people like you, right? It's through people reaching out and telling us, hey, this is happening. This is a microcosm story that you might not know about, or a policy issue that's being fought in Washington that you might not realize is happening. So I would invite, not just me, but any any of us in the journalism world who are doing this work, who report on mental health, and I would invite you to reach out to us. We're pretty easy to find. I'm on TV Kate Snow on every social media platform, so you can write me. People DM me all the time, and that it works. I mean, that's a way that if you're sitting out there wishing that the media would do more or have a certain story you want told, I guess that would be my biggest tip: is don't be afraid, because certainly other people are not afraid to. They're pitching me on like stories about, I don't know, new TV shows and I get all kinds of emails about things that I'm never going to do a story on. I love getting tips on stories about mental health.
Awesome. I love that. Okay. So Kate's closing comments were pitcher, which I love.
Pitch everyone,
pitch
not
everyone,
just me.
not just Kate. Just pitch these good stories. Bruce, I'm going to turn to you.
Yeah, I mean, just +1 on that. Develop a relationship with reporters covering your particular issues in your particular community. Sources make the news. Who journalists and editors hear from and is going to shape not only a particular story, but what the whole news agenda is. I'm talking today from New Haven, Connecticut, and I would love the reporters at our local newspaper to be more in touch with clinicians, with advocates, with clinic directors on a regular basis, even if it's for stuff that never gets published, but is just kind of checking in. Reach out. And again, recognize that when you do that, you're not talking to the media, capital T, capital M. You're talking to individual reporters who probably don't have as many resources as they need, may not have as much training as they need, but who are trying to do a great job. And so you can also steer them to other resources. When you do talk to reporters, steer them to the Carter Center, steer them to the Dart Center, www.dartcenter.org, right? Steer them to places that offer tip sheets that are journalist to journalist and expert to journalist advice on how to do this work. There are lots of best practice guides out there, but engage with journalists on the issues that matter in your own community affecting mental health.
+1 to Bruce and Kate. I will offer a bonus, right? So 2, 1, if there is one thing that you take away from today's session with regard to yourself and your self-care, if you are in the middle of trauma right now, and I say this as a person, not as a mental health clinician, because I am not, but as a person and as a journalist with personal experience in trauma, if you are in the middle of trauma right now, find that one thing that you can do for an extra 5 minutes every day that makes you feel better. Find that one thing you can do for extra 5 minutes a day that makes you feel better. The other thing I want to say to the folks in the room who may not be working in journalists, but serving as sources to journalists or connecting journalists with experts, if you are connecting journalists with folks who all look the same or who are all from the same community, then the stories that journalists will be telling will not be truly representative of the full mental health experience. So those are the 2 things that I want folks to be mindful of. Find that one thing and connect folks with a diverse group of people.
My head is spinning in a good way, filled with all kinds of great ideas. And my heart literally is overflowing with love and gratitude for the 3 of you, for what you do, for the lives that you touch, for the stories that you share, and for the world that you are helping make a better place for the sum of us. I feel I'll just stop there, but I'm feeling sort of overwhelmed by the goodness that you brought to this panel, and for the goodness that you bring to our world. With that, I thank you to all our dear listeners and viewers. Please check out these fabulous folks. You can Google them easily. You can find them. Share your stories, share your tips, and enjoy the rest of the conference. We have a great conference ahead of you.